This is our last installment of this Fitness Factor series to honor the book, The Thyroid Debacle, that we've been doing all year. So, the word finale might light some people up because of what's coming next, or others may be sad to see it go. I don't know. That remains to be seen. Fundamentally, they always say leave the best for last. I absolutely do believe that we've left the best for last because the topic of metabolism, as I was saying to Jeff before, if someone gave me 3 hours to discuss this, I still don't know that I'd necessarily communicate my point in a coherent, detailed manner. So I'm going to do my best at creating a bit of a focus and a narrative for today to understand the major nodes in the network of how metabolism fits into this whole health picture in the context of us being clinicians who are trying to help the people we're working with, because you'll hopefully after this realize that every problem that someone is dealing with is at its core a metabolic problem via some sort of connection pathway. So without further ado, I'm going to do something different today. I want to start with the main takeaway. And the reason I want to do this is because I think it's really impactful to bring things full circle. When a statement is made and then you have all the supporting information and justifications after the fact, if that initial statement still makes sense to you, you have a much better grasp or understanding of it. So the thing that I want to delineate first is that when the word metabolism is used in conversation, in my opinion, it should be the sum of all the biochemical reactions that go on in the body. So it's not just about food in, calories in, energy out. It's really the entire chemical orchestration of how the interconnected system that is our human body maintains itself via the process of biochemistry. That being said, colloquially, and I don't have a really good way of saying that word, I have a hard time pronouncing it, but when we use the word metabolism in health circles, it's a synonym for weight loss, body composition, that kind of thing. So when someone's like, oh, I have a slow metabolism, it may be a reference to issues with losing weight, it may be issues with energy levels. So fundamentally, both of them can be true depending on the context, but you know me, I like to be thorough and comprehensive. So when we're talking metabolism, we're going to focus in on the weight loss body composition thing, but through the lens of understanding how it's all interconnected. Because the last statement is something I want everyone to ponder, or at least have their own version of answer to. And when a metabolic function is poor, we see physical signs of this through the symptoms you experience. But we think the symptom is the issue. When someone has a resistance to being able to lose weight, we think the problem has to do with some sort of weight resistant body sabotage through metabolism. But the reality of the situation is when someone's not able to lose weight as a result of an intention, then might be a conscious decision by the body because of metabolic factors at play that are so poor in their functioning, the body is not able to do so because energetically it doesn't have that kind of power inside of it. So, as I say, this is what most people think of taking the foods we eat in the form of fats and carbohydrates, and hopefully not proteins. If you're burning proteins for energy, that's a really inefficient process. And as a result of taking the calories in the foods we eat, we convert it to something we call ATP. We also make chemical wastes, carbon dioxide, water, not really chemical waste, but byproducts of metabolism, and we generate heat. This is why jumping in a cold pool and then shivering afterwards is good for the metabolism because it stimulates the release of heat, activates brown fat in the body, and theoretically is healthy for metabolism. Being said, this is really what your metabolism is. And there'll be a small, Jeff didn't say this, there's going to be a small test after this lecture, just a small true or false quiz. It's just about this. That's all. So this is every known metabolic pathway in the body. And for me, what's so satisfying about this is the interconnectedness of it all. But smack dab in the center is the single most important factor of metabolism, which is energy production, specifically the Krebs or the citric acid cycle, which is really what people are wanting to emphasize when it comes to the concept of improving energy levels and body composition via weight loss by enhancing your metabolism. So if you think about it this way, humans are a continuous flow of energy and matter, but the world really is. Like, think about the whole concept that the sun beams energy down on a plant. A specialized chemical or a specialized organelle in a plant uses chemical processes called photosynthesis to make these delicious things we call carbohydrates and fats. So it generates energy as a result of a molecule that's made. We eat those molecules in the form of those delicious carbohydrates and fats. We reverse engineer, break them down, and we release the CO2 and the water needed for the plant to generate energy for us again. It's a closed loop system. So the whole process of our metabolism is very much in the vein of how the system operates. It's basically looking at the interactions of all the physiological processes in the body, and what determines the quality or the performance of these processes is the total amount of energy we have. So if you want to break metabolism down to its fundamental cores, the more energy you have, the stronger your metabolism. That's basically, the final statement there. But it's the devil in the details, which we need to understand as clinicians to better help the people who are struggling with aspects of their metabolism, which they don't understand. And we may have to figure out via doing some sort of analysis, figuring out where their aspects of metabolism are compromised. And why a lot of people essentially go round and round the merry-go-round to different practitioners and different people is because of how the allopathic system has conditioned us to see the human body. I believe they missed the integration model of metabolism because they cut the body up into these different sections, and you have a specialist for different organ systems, but there's not a stimulus or an encouragement for those specialists to cross-refer or to converse with other specialists to figure out what's not different, but rather what's the same. In a more functional integrated model, the principles of functional medicine are built upon the body being one interconnected system. And as a result of that, I believe the opportunity is for us to be able to take that philosophy of interconnectedness in the system and understand the processes that keep that system together. And that's what I personally call metabolism. It's how all of these different body systems integrate and function as one, but also how you can justify understanding when there's something going on in the digestive system, why some people experience pains in the joints or pains in the muscles as a result of inflammation in the gut. Nothing is separate. And as a result of how strong our metabolism is, it either determines our ability to sustain health and repair tissues and regenerate, optimally, or it unfortunately basically causes the opposite of the understanding by how things degenerate and how we injure ourselves and unfortunately start to move away from the processes of health. So if you remember one thing about everything that I'm going to say today, energy is everything. And things in the human body start to go wrong when energy is taken away via poor metabolism. And that's how I delineate the two of those things. When there is compromise to the metabolism in the form of self-stress, the ability for the body to make energy goes away because energetic processes that would support that process of breaking food down are actually being consumed by a specific organ that's in a state of compromise or by an immune system that's taking excessive amounts of energy to try to fight off the infection. And another thing that's important to understand, because we are master supplements and U.S.Enzymes at the end of the day, we can't forget the absolute necessity of enzymes being at the core of all metabolic functions. The reason enzymes are there, as a quick reminder, is they accelerate the processes of biochemical reactions in addition to reducing the amount of energy that's used. So they make it faster and they make it more efficient. That's like everyone's dream in 2023, but yet enzymes are quite underappreciated in terms of their importance in biochemical processes in day-to-day conversation, I think, when we're talking about either patient issues, disease processes, what have you. So the enzymes are required to be there for the core of metabolic function. And anything that inappropriately alters the internal environment, this can be anything from heavy metal toxicity, in the form of self-stress, it could be in the form of a digestive infection, it can be in the form of an injury, compromises those metabolic reactions via compromised enzyme function. So fundamentally, you go from having a full cup to a reduced capacity as a result of this seeming stress. And the core elements of what get affected when metabolism becomes compromised are these, in my opinion, 8 key areas that are also highlighted in the book. So anything that compromises digestive health absolutely will burden metabolism because that's where the energy that we essentially break our food down comes in from and gets transported to basic sites of need. Anything in the context of detoxification pathways, when we can't get things that harm the body out of the system, if they are either allowed to circulate or they are put away for storage, that always causes some sort of backlog or some degree of stress to the immune system, possibly leading to inflammation. The ability to regulate carbohydrate levels in the blood or triglyceride levels in the blood, very much directly impactful on energy status. adrenal response, the ability to regulate fight or flight, rest or digest aspects of the immune system, immune response. This is one of the major contributors to what I think the precipitating pathway of metabolic breakdown is, because when the immune system is perturbed, it uses an incredible amount of energy to try to heal the body. But there's one thing about the immune system that I've never forgotten that is not true of any other system in the body. The immune system is the only one that can heal you, but it's also the only one that can hurt you. And if the immune system becomes aberrant, unregulated, and autoimmune processes are at play, that's when the immune system can actually become part of the problem contributing to dysfunctional metabolism. Iron regulation, another huge one. Dr. Eric Balkovich says iron should be like a teenage boy. It needs a chaperone. And if you ever run a blood panel and you see incredibly high levels of ferritin, incredibly high levels of iron, then you know there's some sort of metabolic dysregulation that is causing oxidative stress. Hormone physiology and neurotransmitter physiology, very important in cellular signaling. And inefficient cellular signaling is one of the underpinnings of one of the most commonly known metabolic problems, which are type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So if you were to take all of these, add them up, the sum of all of these processes and how well they're functioning ultimately determines a person's metabolic health in context. Again, a 25-year-old person and an 85-year-old person are going to have different rating scales here. And the important thing to understand is the sum total energy produced by the body, all the mitochondria in every cell of the body, directly correlates with how well these systems are able to regulate interdependently, but also how well they're able to integrate and support our body's ability to stay in a state of health. And what pushes these things out of balance? Well, anything that disrupts the normal flow of function of that, energy physical interplay of the human body is going to take energy away from the system because the body has to deal with being perturbed or being stressed in some way, shape, or form. So nutritional deficiencies or nutritional imbalances, for me, that's including toxicities. Every enzyme in the body requires a cofactor. So when we look at the process of taking carbohydrates and fat and turning them into energy without adequate amounts of vitamin B1 and magnesium, we can't activate the carbohydrate metabolism process. Without, essential amounts of acetylcarnitine, vitamin B2, vitamin B3, B5, and B6, we can't burn carbohydrates or fats. And then we need to have enough amino acids to make our Krebs cycle intermediates. So if someone is not consuming, or more importantly, they're not digesting and absorbing the adequate amounts of nutrients, there's going to be a backlog in the efficiency of that process. The same is true for toxicities. Things can get pushed out of balance when you may think too much of one thing can be a good thing. For example, if someone's taking high amounts of tryptophan or 5-HTP, that can push the balance of branched chain amino acids out of the system, and that can ultimately compromise the body's ability to heal and recover from exercise, for example. So nutritional deficiencies and toxicities and imbalances are a huge stimulus that will push the system out of check. But there's also the aspect of toxic accumulation. If anyone's ever looked at things that inhibit the body's ability to make energy, biochemical compounds, specifically things like heavy metals, directly poison the mitochondrial transport chain to the process where you can generate what's called mitochondrial death as a result of having heavy metal accumulation. So these things coming from the external environment are very strong things that perturb the normal processes in the body. But then there's also the nervous and the endocrine signaling aspects of it. And I call this self-communication. So if someone is always in a state of fight or flight, they're going to be chronically using large amounts of cortisol, which is going to liberate large amounts of carbohydrates from storage to elevate blood sugar. It's going to stimulate the breakdown of muscle tissue to further enhance that blood sugar, which necessitates the release of insulin. So someone's ability to never relax the nervous system is going to push the metabolism out of balance. Same thing with high amounts of estrogen levels, high amounts of testosterone, low amounts of growth hormone. The body loses its ability to regulate because it can't communicate with itself. And then there's the environmental stressors and the internal stressors, which we've talked about in previous fitness factors, so I don't have to rehash that. But the fundamental long and short of this is, above all these changes in the environment and the behavior of cells as part of the ecosystem are basically what falls down. But it's the person who's the individual that feels sick, and at the end result, it is them who gets the diagnosis. So if you understand the previous slide and looking at all the 8 categories of where things get compromised, and you understand what the things that push the body out of balance are, I think it's fair to say that all diseases at some way, in some way, shape, or form, are metabolic problems at their core. And the main connection points fundamentally have to be understood through basic biochemistry. And it really does come down to mitochondrial function. So, what determines metabolic power in a person's body is how well their mitochondrial function is able to be maintained. And fundamentally, it's very simple. It's calories plus oxygen equals energy for the body. So anything that disrupts this process diminishes the body's ability to sustain metabolic power, which reduces the body's ability to ultimately express health and heal itself or recover from a series of stresses. And these are aerobic processes, meaning calories plus oxygen is a very efficient way for the body to make adequate amounts of energy in an efficient manner. Anaerobic is what I call plan B. It's when the body is already compromised, mitochondrial function is diminished to some degree, and the body is making energy in the form of fermentation, and the process is very inefficient and typically yields way less ATP compared to aerobic metabolism. But these are, theoretical constructs. If you were to start talking to your clients about this, their eyes would glaze over really quickly. So fundamentally, we have to take these models and put them into some sort of practical experience or thing that the client can relate to, and we as clinicians can look for and understand what may be going on. So symptomatically, if you have a client saying, "Well, I have a hard time losing weight. I'm accumulating body fat in specific areas of my body." Well, you know that to some degree this is metabolic inefficiency. If someone is complaining about having issues with their blood sugar, they need to eat every couple hours, or they're never satisfied, they're always hungry, or no matter how much water they drink, they're chronically thirsty. This is a different symptom that actually says very much the same thing. If you have a client who's, venturing on a weight loss plan and they want to start exercising, they go to the gym and they're sore for 5 days and they can never recover properly. Poor endurance and intolerance to exercise is another sign of metabolic dysfunction via mitochondrial stress. And for the people who are chronically low energy, no matter how much they sleep, suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, if you look at the core of how those processes develop, the core of them is an inflammatory mitochondrial dysfunction problem. So for me, I'm always trying to put the pieces together of what is the biochemistry trying to do, or what is it telling us via the processes, and what is the human body experiencing that are manifestations of those that we can actually see, identify, and correlate with what the person's actually experiencing. And when it comes to some deeper testing, running some functional medicine labs or some diagnostics, it's really important to understand the different patterns that are at play. So things like elevating fasting blood sugar, high levels of fasting insulin, elevated triglycerides, things like elevated LDL and cholesterol, high levels of HbA1c, multiple hormone imbalances, including high levels of estrogen, low levels of thyroid hormone, high levels of TSH. All of these things are basically signs that the body is trying its best to compromise for a suboptimal state. And as a result, you're seeing the manifestations not only objectively on the lab data in front of you, but likely through how the person is feeling and the symptoms that they are presenting and manifesting. And really, it's all about this process being disrupted. I mean, this is the thing that most people in medical school or in any sort of training really try to memorize for a test and ultimately forget as quickly as possible. But if we understand that no matter what happens, all foods that we eat go through this process, and as a result of this process, ATP is made, we can understand that in order to help someone regenerate, we need to figure out and reverse engineer what we can do from a supplemental, a diet, or a lifestyle factor that can help regenerate the body's ability to make ATP quite efficiently. And it does exist on a continuum because fundamentally, if we have strong, healthy mitochondrial function, we have enough energy to do all we want, and we see the signs of what this may look like in a healthy body. Someone who has a healthy body composition range, someone who has healthy skin, brightness in their eyes, healthy looking hair, the ability to maintain and build muscle mass. These are signs of healthy metabolism. As this starts to go away and we move from the continuum to dysfunctional, we start to experience, first and foremost, the symptoms, the signs of the symptoms that take us there. But as that process starts to develop even further, this is when multiple body systems start breaking down. People are put on medications to deal with their symptoms, and then they're taking medications to deal with a side effect of other medications, because fundamentally it's become a system-wide mitochondrial problem. So this relationship is really important to remember. Mitochondrial dysfunction is an inverse in its relationship with health. The greater the degree of dysfunction, the greater degree of oxidative stress you're going to see, the greater degree of systemic inflammation you're going to see, compromised cellular function, compromised cellular signaling, and ultimately the inability to heal and repair. And as a result of us being clinicians, the question becomes, how do we get this back online by dealing in the proper order of operations with what the client's presenting, and how we can work with them in a variety of different contexts to regenerate these processes? That I want to touch on later, because the experiential nature of it is actually it's quite complex, but it's also very much a self-sustaining feedback cycle. What I mean by that is the body in a state of compromise will keep itself in that state of compromise, and you have to figure out what the blocks are in order to have the body essentially regenerate itself again. When someone is this big, or when they are this metabolically dysregulated, what we think is they have too much energy coming into their system. The reality is they have too much energy coming into their system, but they're experiencing an energy crisis, meaning they may be excessively endowed with energy, but their cells are starving. And over the course of that period of time that they're experiencing this, they start to experience other areas of the body become extremely compromised. So if you look at the occurrence of Alzheimer's disease in people with a history of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, it's incredibly strong. Things like the development of heart disease, autoimmune conditions, even things as simple as psoriasis can predispose someone to developing these kinds of conditions. And then over time, the most energy hungry organ in the body, i.e., the brain, starts to really deteriorate and break down, which is why you see increased risks of vascular dementia and stroke. So if you start to understand the patterns that these people present, you can start to strategize and coordinate a variety of different interventions in the style of helping the body get back to baseline through regenerating the different body systems that have become compromised as a result of metabolism. And if there's one thing that we can blame this on, it's really in the context of chronic inflammation. And how I always see inflammation with people that I work with is any place chronic inflammation shows up, that area will experience an energy crisis. Over time, this chronically devoid energy crisis and the compensation as a result of it will deplete the energy in the body, and in the specific organ in question will eventually become diseased. So in my world, all chronic degenerative conditions, again, are metabolic problems. And understanding the nature of this is very much like a teeter-totter. So when you have a cell that's in chronic oxidative stress, you have damaged mitochondria, you have disrupted signaling. Those cells have a very short lifespan, and as a result of their short lifespan, the aging process is accelerated. On the other side, when the cell is adequately equipped with the machinery to break energy down and to use energy properly, that cell is in a state of healthy anabolism. So the concepts of repair, regeneration, and health overall are able to be sustained. So it's figuring out, how do we understand where the client is in this process when they come in, and what are our select strategies in order to reverse engineer this process back to health. And I thought it was really interesting in doing my research for this lecture that I looked at a lot of the models out there. And let's be honest, some of these graphics are incredible, but they're incredibly complex. But there's a fundamental pattern that underpins almost all of them. And I have two here as an example. Oxidative stress causing mitochondrial dysfunction increases the amount of reactive oxidative species being generated. As a result of all that, you have these downstream inflammatory processes that in this case have been connected to and correlate to the process of Alzheimer's disease. So this is a non-specific metabolic problem that occurs in an organ. And if this problem is able to be maintained and sustained for a period of time, probably 2-3 decades, then the resulting adaptation the body chooses is Alzheimer's disease, which has been in the last 10 years named type 3 diabetes, because it's typically correlated with insulin resistance of the brain, which is the most energy dense and energy hungry organ in the body. But if we look at the pattern for something like diabetic neuropathy, well, we have the activation of pro-inflammatory transcription factors, i.e. the NF-kappa B. What that does is it increases the production of cytokines. It causes various aspects of inflammatory processes that generate systemic responses in the form of neuroinflammation, which then cause the ability for the nervous system to essentially be affected by these negatively. And you have the same process, inflammation and oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, and the resulting nerve damage, rather than selecting for the brain and manifest as Alzheimer's disease, in this case, manifests as nerve damage via diabetic neuropathy. So what this does in my mind is it makes this process so much less intimidating and so much less worrisome, because we don't have to follow the disease. We don't have to get distracted by the shiny object. Rather, we have to understand all the cofactors that come together. We have to divide our ability to understand the objective and the subjective symptoms, and essentially create an approach and a strategy to really help us find a path back to the client. Because when someone is in this state, this is a process that can beget the development of other processes. What I mean by that is when someone is in a state of metabolic compromise, their body is in a multiple disease-prone status. So when we look at, weight gain and the compromised ability to lose weight, this is more of a side effect of the body trying to keep itself protected from something that's causing it to be stressed out. And if I can go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, if you understand the process of how the body stores fat, there is a very specific initial process where most of the fat that we store is subcutaneous. This is the stuff under the skin, not super dangerous, but mostly people get concerned about when they go to the beach. This kind of fat isn't necessarily metabolically compromising. This is a healthy degree of fat storage that all people should have. If someone starts to become metabolically compromised, they fill up their subcutaneous fat stores initially. And the next step in the process is visceral fat storage. And visceral fat storage is different because this is when the body starts storing fat around the internal organs. And as a result, the internal organ becomes compromised because it essentially merges as one with this fat that's stored on it. So all of a sudden you start seeing signs of metabolic disruption or dysregulation, where there's a little bit more insulin resistance. There's a little bit less energy production. There's maybe a little bit more inflammation. And if the process that's driving that continues to get worse, the last area that the body stores fat is intra-organ or intramuscular. And the reason that this shouldn't ever happen is because there are no fat cells in an organ. Fat cells develop around the organ. So when the fat is being deposited in the organ or in the muscle, it's become a metabolic problem. And what this does is it starts to activate changes in the immune system and changes in the endocrine system. What happens is you have over fat adipocytes, meaning your fat cells are essentially maxed out on how much fat they can store. So they're constantly trying to store, but they're also releasing fat back into the bloodstream. This is what happens when you see people who have high glucose, high insulin, high cholesterol, and chronically high triglycerides. But it's not the only thing that happens. And this is where nature is a little bit cruel. Every lean tissue organ in the body, when someone's excessively heavy, becomes insulin resistant, except fat cells. So they still start driving that inflammatory response because fat is always trying to be stored away. And these fat cells become metabolically active because your white blood cells start to migrate there. They start generating all kinds of cytokines, and they start generating estrogen as well. So when this happens, you have the compounding effects of the endocrine system driving an increased inflammatory response, and excessively accumulated fat tissue becomes an additional metabolic organ. It's just like the microbiome typically acts like an organ. Your adipocytes, when they're overstocked with stored fat, become their own metabolic organ. And what they end up doing is causing dysregulation to the brain satiety. They cause their own generation of inflammatory cytokines. They downregulate the body's efficient ability to produce energy from the food they eat, and it compromises the body's ability to actually burn the fat that's being stored. So whereas before we were talking about the mechanisms of how an energy crisis may play out biochemically, this is what an energy crisis looks like experientially. So even though this person has excessive energy on their body, their cells are starving. As a result of their cells starving, their mitochondria are becoming weak, dysfunctional. Those dysfunctional mitochondria are giving birth to weak daughter mitochondria that are also dysfunctional. And this person is essentially starving to death, even though they have a bountiful amount of energy stored on their body. And I tried to think about how can I make this, this metabolic dysfunction, chronic degeneration thing into an analogy. From my research and also from what I have experienced working with people, no matter what the disease diagnosis is, if it's metabolic in nature, it's connected to mitochondrial dysfunction. If it's mitochondrial in nature, it's connected to energy. One of my favorite statements that I've ever heard is we get sick when our rate of injury exceeds our rate of repair. So it's the same fundamental plot, no matter if it's watching Superman, if it's watching Batman, if it's watching, I don't know, any of the Marvel movies, but they're different characters in different settings. The same protagonist is the individual who wants to be healthy. The person who's struggling, they've gone to different personal trainers, exercise didn't work. They've gone to different dieting specialists, that didn't work. They've gone to different health practitioners, no one could figure out what was going on. It's not that those people didn't have good intentions. It just might have been that they weren't uncovering what they needed to uncover at the right rate of speed. And that person may have been impatient, or may have been engaging in things that were not necessarily optimal for them at that moment in time. But the antagonists of the things, the disease diagnosis and the metabolic dysregulations, these are the things that are all working together. So fundamentally, the ability to heal metabolism, in my opinion, is a hero's journey. I try to explain that to everyone. The fundamental patterns of the disease are all the same. It's where the disease shows up and manifests and how the metabolic function is being compromised that ultimately leads to where that person is unfortunately experiencing their state of compromise. So the question becomes, well, what do we do? Fundamentally, we need to bring communication and coherence back to the body. There's a reason that every January gyms are full of people for New Year's resolutions, and by April, the vast majority of those people are gone. Because I think we're approaching metabolism, metabolic dysfunction, and weight loss entirely inappropriately because we're not using it as a system. We think it's calories in and calories out, or it's eat less and move more. But if you look at the stats, the percentage of Americans who are classified as obese is probably startlingly high. It's in the 50s nowadays. And I think the classification of overweight is above 75%. So this is the philosophy of approach that I personally take because I'm not dealing with weight loss. I'm not dealing with a metabolic issue of excessive weight as the core problem. I'm trying to come at it from the other end, going, why is the body unwilling to burn the energy? And why is it so interested or intent on storing this energy? So for me, if there's inflammation present and inflammation compromises metabolism, I need to address the inflammation. And only once I've addressed the problem can I then figure out what cacophony or combination of signals I can use to enhance and upregulate the metabolism so the body can get back into balance. And the first area I start, surprise, surprise, is digestion. You can eat the best diet in the world, and we've talked about this at length. If you're not breaking down your food, you're not giving the body ultimately what it needs. So if the process of digestion is compromised, if there is not enough hydrochloric acid, not enough bile, not enough enzymes or bicarbonate, that process is going to be dysregulated. So in order to help someone break down their food and provide nutrition to their body, the first place I start, because we know from digestion, we then bridge the gap to the development of dysbiosis, the pathogenesis of different kinds of strains and species in the gut. And as a result of that, the consequence of immune activation and leaky gut is going to be developed as a result of chronic digestive dysfunction. And for most people, and this is something that I've experienced a lot, if you help them resolve their gut issues, they will lose weight without making any changes to their diet just because they're not causing their body to be poisoned every time they eat something. And if you do one step better, you address the general makeup of the diet and have them eat foods that are not only beneficial for them, but are anti-inflammatory by nature, you're going to supercharge that effect. And then the third thing is addressing nutritional deficiencies, and that is done via diet, but also specific and strategic supplementation. So for me, the first part of addressing any weight loss is making sure that the window into the body and what is going into the body is accounted for. Because ultimately, the food we eat becomes what our body is constructed of. So it's a cliche thing, but garbage in, garbage out. You can't make healthy cells from poor quality food. But we assume that just because we eat healthy food, we're doing our bodies a favor. Ultimately, we need to make sure that we digest, break down, assimilate, and utilize those nutrients. And we need to understand all those biochemical processes that were earlier in the lecture in order for us to know how to strategically supplement and rid the body of any compromises from the first three things. The next thing is removing any kind of toxic chemicals that are inhibitors. And to this, I will add um, viral infections, bacterial infections, things of that nature. Anything that comes from the outside world that has created a problem on the inside world that is becoming what I call an inhibitor of metabolism. You can't fully push the pace on metabolism until you've dealt with the thing that's in the way. So if I've taken care of the fact that I'm digesting better, my GI system is better, but something is still in my system, upregulating detoxification, biotransformation, and elimination, making sure the bowels are moving on a regular basis, the kidneys are functioning, and hopefully that person is moving and sweating at a reasonable pace, then you're going to help the body shed what is holding it back. And then you get to the part where a lot of people start with. I figure out how to use strategic aspects of diet, supplementation, and exercise only once all the above things are being taken care of. Because if I'm going to take my car to the racetrack and I don't have enough gas in the tank, or my tires are old, or I have no brakes left, I'm not going to try to drive quickly. For me, someone going to the gym is like taking their car to the racetrack. They're asking high performance of something that may not be up to code. So here's where you can use things like intermittent fasting, carb cycling, potentially therapeutic ketogenic diets, but it's also where you put the kinds of nutrition and supplementation that is appropriate here. Because in some cases, using things like mitochondrial support formulas, high dose herbal support formulas, they may be well intended, but if you have an active viral infection, they like B vitamins and iron and minerals as well. So this is my philosophical approach. If you look at the metabolism as a whole, you look at all the connection pathways, that's really what allows you to do your due diligence to make sure that you've looked at the body as an integrated system and you've addressed it in the same way. And the happy accident of doing all of this is people naturally lose weight. I can't tell you how many times I've had people shocked where getting inflammatory foods out of their diet, giving them a digestive enzyme, a probiotic, and a systemic enzyme makes a massive difference. And they're confused because we didn't do any kind of dieting. It's like that comes after the fact. If you get the body working well, you can kind of get away with eating that necessarily as optimally. But being a supplement company and being well versed in understanding that digestion, microbiome function, and inflammation is really what this company goes after, there are specific tools that plug themselves into this formula along the way at different levels. So one thing that I reach for, and Jeff and I were talking about this right before the lecture started, is high dose antioxidant therapy for someone who's in chronic crisis. So intracellular inflammation is really what underpins all mitochondrial dysfunction. And most people think, antioxidants, they think beta carotene, alpha lipoic acid, vitamin C, vitamin E. These are important antioxidants systemically, but intracellularly, the body has these three very powerful antioxidants that work in the system. And that system is catalase, superoxide dismutase, and glutathione peroxidase. Most people know glutathione in terms of supplemental NAC. A lot of people know liposomal glutathione or potentially doing a glutathione push with intravenous therapy, but not many people think of catalase and superoxide dismutase, which in many cases are even more powerful at how fast they can neutralize biochemical reactions in the cell than glutathione peroxidase. So the thing that causes the major disruption in a cell, and the term I use is rusting. Cellular rust is caused by what's called a superoxide. And the connection point is under conditions of mitochondrial dysfunction, excessive amounts of superoxides are made because the mitochondrial electron transport chain isn't making ATP, it's making excessive amounts of free radicals. So the first step in neutralizing a superoxide is using something like superoxide dismutase. And there's different forms of it. There's a copper form, a zinc, and a manganese form. And different superoxides are neutralized by this combination superoxide dismutase system, and it generates a new compound called hydrogen peroxide. Is it healthy? Not necessarily, but it's one step less nefarious than superoxides are. But this is where the combination team comes in, because hydrogen peroxide acted upon by catalase or glutathione peroxidase becomes neutralized to water. Essentially, it just removes an oxygen molecule, but it goes from a potentially hazardous compound to something that hydrates you. And there's a nice little link there if people want a very short blog and brushing up on this, because these antioxidant systems are not spoken about a lot because they're different from, food-based antioxidants. They're amino acid-based antioxidant systems. And if someone is nutritionally deficient, if they're not able to digest their proteins properly, or they're not able to assimilate their amino acids properly, making these antioxidant enzymes becomes compromised. And as a result of excessive amounts of superoxide, that generates a high amount of cell stress. But when we have the necessary antioxidant systems, we can neutralize the stress so the body can get back to healing, because you've taken away the excessive amounts of rust and you've increased the amount of energy that's being generated as a result of the food that they're eating. And if, that's something that needs to be layered in with an additional antioxidant support, I look at U.S.Enzyme as more of an acute response. If someone's in a serious crisis setting, using that can be a really good stimuli to get them out of a crisis response and bring inflammation down to some degree. But stimulating the antioxidant pathway is something that can be very beneficial for people who are struggling to lose weight. Because again, if it's an inflammatory problem, you actually want to stimulate the body to get out of a healing crisis. And that's what sulforazyme does really well. Specifically speaking, sulforaphane directly stimulates the NRF2 pathway, which is the body's natural antioxidant response system. And it's also a detoxification system in the liver. So how I look at sulforazyme, this is more of a longer play. Once you've got the body into a state where you can upregulate detoxification, there's some more energy there so the body can generate the ability to heal. Moving from a U.S.Enzyme to a sulforazyme might be something that essentially resets the body out of a stuck cycle. And this is what I mean by a stuck cycle. So excessive oxidative stress generates excessive amounts of reactive oxygen species. The reactive oxygen species, when not neutralized, generate inflammatory cytokines that increase the amount of oxidative stress. So this wheel keeps going round and round, and as a result, you have accelerated aging, or inflammaging as the term is used here, because you also have compromised detoxification. The toxic load is being held in greater degree and greater quantity by the body. What NRF2 does is it breaks this cycle by breaking the overall transcription factor that's at play, the one we call NF kappa B. It's the Joker to the NRF2's Batman. So when you upregulate NRF2, you upregulate all other antioxidant systems in the cell, because it's not that you're taking something that directly neutralizes free radical stresses. You're upregulating a transcription factor that makes the body get out of a healing crisis and enter a healing cycle. And this is an important thing, because in some cases, too quickly upregulating these processes in people who are very sick can actually make them feel worse temporarily, because if you follow that arrow there, NRF2 and sulforaphane do upregulate phase 2 detoxification enzymes. And anytime you upregulate detoxification, you're increasing the amount of toxic load that's being dumped into the digestive system wanting to be removed. If that client has issues with bowel function, any kind of constipation, or any sort of bowel trouble where they have a hard time regulating, having frequent bowel movements, you don't want to simulate aggressive detoxification too early, or else you're going to compound the problem. And that's why I separate these two into a phase 1 and a phase 2, because U.S.Enzyme has no necessary upregulations of antioxidant enzymes in addition to detoxification. It's just going to help neutralization, where sulforazyme is going to work a little bit differently in a more wider scope, or a wider cast net, in terms of how it's going to regulate the body's ability to get out of an inflammatory crisis. And I wanted to give some honorable mentions, what I don't typically do because we focus on 1 or 2 main products here. But if you look at our product line, there really is something for every avenue of inflammation, but the key here is understanding the pathways and the specific means by which these supplements work on. So Therazyme, which is my forever supplement, I call this my desert island supplement, maybe after a digestive enzyme. Therazyme is a combination of all our systemic proteolytic enzymes. And why Therazyme is such an amazing product is because it works on multiple body systems simultaneously. so that if inflammation is systemic, and for the most part, if something is in one area, eventually it becomes a systemic problem, you have the ability to assist the immune system, specifically at nighttime when repair happens, in being able to neutralize or at least resolve some degree of inflammation based upon where these enzymes are active. So you have C-pros-S, that's very much active in the respiratory mucosa in the lungs. You have seropeptidase, very much active in the connective tissue, the joints, and probably to some degree the gut, the biofilms, and the circulatory system. You have nattokinase, which is an absolute wonder for the cardiovascular and circulatory system. You have different proteases that act probably at the gut mucosal level, but also systemically to bring down various aspects of, foodborne inflammatory proteins from food sensitivities, environmental compounds that have been inhaled. So this is really your all-in-one systemic immune support. I mentioned in the middle of this lecture that what enzymes do is they speed up reactions while reducing the amount of energy used to make those reactions happen. So anytime there's inflammation in our bodies, it's our immune systems that are actually having to deal with this. So the immune system needs to neutralize the problem. The body needs to recognize the threat is gone. Then the immune system needs to stimulate the remodeling or the regeneration of that compromised tissue. Enzymes help the immune system deal with the threat and break down the inflammatory response much more efficiently, but they have to be used regularly and they have to be used over a period of time to really see the benefit be felt and likely seen by the patient via however you're assessing. Looking at something like Tavigo, this is one of those supplements I would use in that fifth step of my process because green tea extract has a lot of really good research behind enhancing metabolism via upregulation of burning fat for energy, what's called beta oxidation. So green tea extract is great because a lot of people who are sympathetically dominant are also caffeine sensitive. So you can get around the potential jitters of someone who may not be able to tolerate tea or coffee, but have the benefits of the metabolic boosting function that green tea extract typically has. Is this going to massively transform someone by taking it on its own? No. But with the proper dietary, lifestyle, and exercise practices, it's going to generate a momentum in the right direction, ultimately to help them achieve their goals of regeneration of metabolic function and the reduction of excessive body fat tissue. Sun spectrum, and this can be true of all the fibers, but sun spectrum specifically was designed for people with chronic inflammatory issues. So besides the sun fiber, which is really good at increasing levels of butyrate in the gut, which we know butyrate as a short-chain fatty acid, is an incredibly powerful stimulator of reducing inflammation locally in the gut. If you look at some of the research, what seems to happen is when you reduce the amount of inflammation locally in the gut, there's a systemic effect of reducing systemic inflammation and increasing the efficiency of mitochondrial function. So that alone is beneficial via the sun fiber, but there's also the addition of coenzyme Q10 and turmeric, which are two very well-known anti-inflammatory nutrients. So these three alone can help metabolism in a variety of different ways, and theoretically could be a very healthy metabolic stack for someone in their fifth stage of process. But there's also other things. We talked about what happens in the gut ultimately becomes something systemically. And the reason True Bifido Pro was created was the request was made for a probiotic that had only anti-inflammatory cytokines. So this doesn't mean that by taking this probiotic, your body only makes anti-inflammatory cytokines. But again, what happens in the gut, which is where most of the immune cells reside, directly affects and stimulates processes in the rest of the body. If you can down-regulate localized GI inflammation, then you can stimulate the remodeling of gut cells and help to regenerate the process of leaky gut. Because you have to remember that the digestive cells are the fastest replicating cells in the body. They replicate on average every 3 to 5 days, which is great if you want to heal leaky gut, but it's also not so great because the body can develop leaky gut really quickly after an inflammatory insult. So using something like a True Bifido Pro for someone who's in a really compromised state metabolically would be my first go-to to see if they could tolerate it and improve GI function and bowel motility and stuff of that nature. Some people want to focus on dietary strategies, and there have been a lot of people that have been pushed into this movement of low carb, but also more ancestral style dieting in the last little while. And I think in many cases, it has a lot of therapeutic effects for the right population. But there's one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily think about. And I hear this a lot. I hear someone say, "Oh, I tried keto and it didn't work for me." Well, the reason the ketogenic diet sometimes doesn't work is how you're doing it. If you're doing nothing but bacon, mayonnaise, and I don't know, ground beef, it's not going to be successful long term. But people forget that if you restrict carbohydrates and you greatly increase fats, you very much bias and place an additional burden on your digestive system. And the burden you place is specifically on your pancreas to make a lot of lipase and for your gallbladder to make a lot of bile. If someone is metabolically compromised and they have liver gallbladder problems, this could be an absolute nightmare for them because, well, the diet fundamentally in its structure is good to stimulate the body's ability to lower blood sugar and burn fat, not only from the food you eat, but from fat that's stored on the body. If they can't properly digest that food, it likely will make them worse and will contribute to an even further worsening of their probably already dysbiotic like symptoms in their gut. So that's why if someone tells me they're going to use a low carb diet, Enzalase is my choice for two reasons. One, there's a high quantity of lipase, so it's, in my opinion, a fat-specific digestive enzyme supplement. It does a better job at digesting fats in its formulation than it does carbohydrates. But it also has our patented technology that allows for delayed emptying of the contents of the capsule because you don't want fat digestion in the stomach. You want fat digestion in the small intestine after you've gone past the common bile duct where the pancreas ducts in enzymes and the gallbladder ducts in bile. So Enzalase is a really good option for people who are reducing or restricting carbohydrates and trying to increase healthy fats and proteins in order to make sure that if they're going to follow this kind of diet, this diet is going to be well digested to maximize the chances for their positive and beneficial results as a result of doing so. And then the last thing that I would select would be talking about nutritional deficiencies potentially being an issue. We don't have a multivitamin per se, but Immunozyme is designed to do two things: provide the specific micronutrients that your immune system needs in order to be able to both raise and lower inflammation, and to some degree restore micronutrient deficiency should someone have not been able to A, eat a diet that is nutritionally dense, B, digest a diet efficiently that allows for the absorption of certain nutrients. Back to the previous topic of conversation, our fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin D, and vitamin K, are required to be bound to a molecule of fat, and they go into the same sort of circulation that our fats do when we digest and absorb them. If someone is not making the adequate amount of bile or digestive enzymes and they're not properly digesting their fats, it's very likely that they're going to become nutritionally deficient in their fat soluble vitamins. The reality of the situation is vitamin A and vitamin D are two of the most important vitamins to regulate immune function, specifically the body's ability to resolve inflammation through the immune system. In addition to that, vitamin E is a very strong antioxidant, specifically for the cardiovascular system. And vitamin K2, K1 specifically helps with bone mineral density. K2 pulls calcium out of soft tissues. So understanding the nature of these nutrients and the hierarchy of micronutrient necessity for inflammation is really important. So again, this could be a stack in and of itself, but it comes back to where does this fit into the concept of what we were talking about today? How would you justify and rationalize your decision? And ultimately, what would be your approach given the person that you're working with and the symptoms they're presenting? There's a couple really good articles that I read for the creation of this slideshow, and I thought I'd share them with everyone. And with that, I want to thank you for the fitness factor journey. And I wanted to leave a few minutes just in case we had a couple questions at the end. So